Have you ever wondered what it's like when police break down your door, call your life's work trash, and search your home for drugs that don't exist? Because one successful black woman was about to learn that writing best-selling books and speaking the truth made her a target. And this morning's raid would either silence her forever or turn her into the most dangerous voice they never wanted to create. Before I go further, if you love interesting stories like this that expose the truth, please give this video a thumbs up and tell us in the comments section where in the world you are watching this video, and also do well to smash that subscribe button. Okay, let's proceed with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street when Nova Borden heard the first heavy footstep on her front porch. She was in her home office, coffee still steaming beside her laptop, reviewing the final edits for her upcoming appearance on a national talk show. Her book, Breaking Barriers, A Voice for Change, had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and speaking requests flooded her inbox daily. At 34, she had built a platform that reached millions, a voice that couldn't be ignored. The footsteps multiplied. Heavy boots, multiple sets. Nova's fingers froze over her keyboard as a chill ran down her spine. She knew that sound from the stories her grandmother used to tell, from the history books that documented raids in communities that looked like hers. Don't move! Hands on your head! Get out of bed! The commanding voices shattered the morning calm. Nova's heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly raised her hands, confusion and fear battling for dominance in her mind. She wasn't in bed. She was working, as she did every morning at 7 a.m., building the empire she'd constructed word by word, speech by speech. "My name is Nova Borden," she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm the owner of this house. Chris lives here too, but he's at work. I have no weapons. Why have you broken into my home?" The front door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire house. 3 white officers stormed through, weapons drawn, their faces set in grim determination. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with steel-gray eyes, surveyed the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "We have a warrant to search this property for narcotics," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion as he approached Nova. His badge read Sergeant Mitchell. Nova's mind reeled. Narcotics? She barely drank alcohol, let alone touch drugs. Her entire career was built on credibility, on being above reproach. Every aspect of her life was scrutinized by both supporters and detractors. She couldn't afford even the appearance of impropriety. As the officers spread throughout her home, Nova watched helplessly as they began tearing through her space. One officer knocked over a framed photo of her with Dr. Angela Davis from a recent conference. Another rifled through her bookshelf, sending carefully organized volumes of poetry, sociology, and political theory cascading to the floor. "Looks like a bunch of liberal trash," sneered Officer Johnson, the youngest of the 3, as he kicked aside a copy of The Fire Next Time. "From this liberal trap." The words hit Nova like a physical blow. She watched as they dismissed the work of James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, and Ta-Nehisi Coates as trash, the very authors who had shaped her worldview and informed her advocacy. "Hey, wait," Sergeant Mitchell said, his tone shifting as he studied Nova more closely. "How long have you lived at this residence? You need to answer me." "I've been here for 13 months, Nova replied, her voice gaining strength. She had bought this house with her book advance and speaking fees, had saved every penny to afford the down payment in this neighborhood, where she was often the only black face at community meetings. "How can you afford a home like this by yourself?" Officer Johnson interjected, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You taking money from the movement like all your friends?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Nova felt the familiar rage that came when people assumed her success was unearned, when they couldn't fathom that a black woman might build something through her own intelligence and hard work. "I work," she said firmly, her journalist's training keeping her voice level. I have speaking engagements. My book lives on the Times bestseller list. And my website gets over 2 million unique impressions a month. Professional agitator, Sergeant Mitchell muttered under his breath. But Nova caught every word. Got it. The dismissal in his voice was absolute. Everything she had built, the years of research, the sleepless nights writing, the courage it took to speak truth to power, reduced to 2 words that painted her as nothing more than a troublemaker. As the officers continued their search, Nova became aware of voices outside. Through her window, she could see her neighbor Marcus Thompson approaching her front yard. Marcus was a retired teacher, a man in his 60s who had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades. He had been one of the first to welcome her when she moved in, bringing over a homemade peach pie and stories about the community's history. I'm her neighbor, and this doesn't concern you, Sergeant Mitchell said as Marcus drew closer to the commotion. Marcus stopped at the edge of Nova's property line, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. He was tall and dignified, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect in any room. But Nova could see the familiar tension in his shoulders, the same tension that lived in the bodies of black men who had navigated decades of such encounters. Anything you do to hurt anyone on this block concerns me, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had taught high school for 35 years. This is my community. Nova felt a surge of gratitude for his presence, even as she worried for his safety. She knew the statistics, knew how quickly situations like this could escalate when black men asserted themselves in the presence of aggressive law enforcement. Inside the house, the destruction continued. Officer Johnson upended her desk drawer, sending business cards, awards, and speaking contracts scattering across the hardwood floor. Another officer emerged from her bedroom, having clearly torn through her private spaces with no regard for her dignity or privacy. Where's my phone? Nova demanded, suddenly realizing she needed to document what was happening. I want to document this. You can't stop me from recording, she added when she saw the officers exchange glances. But Sergeant Mitchell was already moving toward her, his intention clear. The phone that had been sitting on her kitchen counter was now nowhere to be seen. Nova realized with growing alarm that they had no intention of allowing her to capture evidence of their conduct. Through the window, she could see Marcus pulling out his own phone. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw him nod slightly. A silent promise that someone would bear witness to what was happening to her. The search continued with increasing aggression. They found nothing because there was nothing to find, but that didn't stop them from treating every book, every piece of furniture, every personal item as if it might be hiding contraband. Officer Johnson seemed particularly focused on her office, where printed copies of her speeches and research materials were strewn about like confetti. What's all this? He asked, holding up a draft of her upcoming speech about police reform. Nova felt her stomach drop. The speech was part of a series she was developing about accountability in law enforcement, about the need for systemic change. Now, as she watched this officer read her words calling for the very kind of professional standards his own conduct was violating. The irony was almost overwhelming. It's my work, she said simply. Officer Johnson's laugh was cold. Your work is stirring up trouble. My work is telling the truth, Nova replied, her fear beginning to transform into the fierce determination that had driven her entire career. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Nova began to piece together what was really happening. This wasn't about narcotics. There were no drugs in her house, and any serious investigation would have quickly determined that. This was about intimidation. This was about sending a message to a black woman who had dared to build a platform, who had dared to speak truth to power, who had dared to succeed. She thought about the threatening emails she'd been receiving lately, the uptick in harassment since her last television appearance where she'd spoken about the need for police reform. She thought about the trolls who flooded her social media with vitriol, whenever she posted about racial justice. She had always known that her visibility came with risks, but she had never imagined it would lead to this. Armed officers in her home, treating her like a criminal for the crime of having opinions while black. Outside, Marcus had been joined by other neighbors. Nova could see Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, holding her phone up to record. The Johnson family from across the street stood on their porch, their teenage daughter live streaming on social media. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his house, had come out to see what was happening. The community was watching. The community was recording. And Nova realized that even in this moment of violation and fear, she was not alone. Sergeant Mitchell seemed to notice the growing crowd as well. He spoke in low tones to his fellow officers, and Nova caught fragments of their conversation. Something about making this quick and too many witnesses. After another 30 minutes of fruitless searching, the officers finally seemed ready to leave. They had found nothing because there was nothing to find, but they had accomplished their real goal. They had invaded her space, violated her privacy, and sent a clear message about what happened to people who spoke too loudly. "We'll be watching you," Sergeant Mitchell said as they prepared to leave, his words carrying an unmistakable threat. Nova stood in the wreckage of her home. Papers scattered, furniture overturned, personal items strewn across the floor. But as she looked out at her neighbors, at Marcus still standing guard at the edge of her property, at the phone still recording, she felt something unexpected. Hope. "I'll be watching too," she said quietly, but loud enough for the officers to hear. After they left, Marcus approached her door. "Nova, are you okay?" She invited him in, and together they began the process of putting her home back together. As they worked, Nova's phone, which had mysteriously reappeared on her counter after the officers left, began buzzing with notifications. The neighbors' recordings had already begun circulating on social media. News outlets were picking up the story. Her publisher was calling. "They thought they could silence me," Nova said as she picked up a torn page from one of her speeches. "But they just gave me a bigger microphone." Marcus nodded, his eyes sad but understanding. "That's how it works sometimes. They try to break you down, but all they do is show the world who they really are." That evening, Nova sat at her laptop, her home mostly restored, and began to write. She wrote about the morning's events, about the fear and the violation, but also about the community that had rallied around her. She wrote about the necessity of speaking truth, even when, especially when, that truth made some people uncomfortable. She wrote about a country where a black woman could build success through her own merit and still find armed officers at her door, where excellence was met with suspicion, where prosperity was assumed to be illegitimate. But she also wrote about neighbors who showed up, about phones that recorded truth, about communities that refused to let injustice happen in silence. By the time she finished writing, it was nearly midnight. Her essay was 2,000 words of raw truth and unflinching honesty. She read it over once, then posted it to her website. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. News outlets were calling. Civil rights organizations were offering support. Other public figures were sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The raid that was meant to silence Nova Borden had instead amplified her voice beyond anything she could have imagined. And as she finally went to sleep that night, she smiled thinking about how Sergeant Mitchell and his officers had unwittingly proved every point she had ever made about the need for accountability, reform, and justice. They had tried to make her afraid. Instead, they had made her dangerous. Dangerous to a system that relied on silence, complicity, and fear. Nova Borden was no longer just a successful author and speaker. She was now a symbol of resistance, a reminder that some voices cannot be silenced, no matter how hard some people try. The raid was over, but Nova's real work was just beginning.